The whole universe is in motion, and everything moves in an orderly pattern. Once each year, the earth circles around the sun. Every night is followed by another day. And the seasons come and go with perfect regularity. Spring is a time when the world around us comes to life. In summer, the blossoms and shoots ripen into fruits and grain. Autumn is the harvest season, when the fruits of the growing season are gathered and stored. And winter is barren and cold. The earth is frozen and still. But praise God that He does not abandon us to an everlasting winter. We know that the seasons have come full circle, and that a new springtime is not far off. Soon the frost will melt, and all the earth will once again become fresh and green. It is the same with religion. When people turn away from God, their hearts become barren and lifeless. The world becomes a spiritual desert. But the Word of God is the water of life. When a prophet comes into the world bearing a holy message, all the thirsty souls are refreshed, and the lifeless hearts become joyful. In every age, God sends His messenger to mankind, so that the world may be changed into a beautiful garden. He sent Moses with a holy book to teach the children of Israel. The Hindus raised up temples in praise of God, and through the teachings of Krishna, learned to seek His guidance in prayer. He sent Buddha with sacred scriptures to guide the peoples of the East to the path of God. To the people of Persia, He sent Zoroaster, upon whose teachings a mighty civilization was founded. In a later age, He sent Jesus with a New Testament, a gospel that would be preached throughout the world. He sent Mohammed to the warring tribes of the desert. He taught them in the Quran to be unified, and raised them up to be a great civilization. In this day, God has once again spoken to mankind. He has sent the Bab and Baha'u'llah, with writings that will unite all the peoples and religions of the world. The Baha'i faith began in Persia over 100 years ago. In those days, the kings of Persia, called Shahs, were only mindful of their own luxury and pleasure. The religion of Persia was Islam, the law of God brought by the Prophet Muhammad. But in the 1840s, the bright light of Muhammad's teachings had been darkened. People had turned away from God. Historians described 19th century Persia as a backward nation. Many of the people were poor and uneducated. Some of them turned to opium to escape from the hardships of life. Though seemingly pious, many of the priests were greedy and dishonest. And yet there was hope. A handful of pure and saintly men were deeply convinced that the time had come for God to send another messenger. They scattered across the length and breadth of Persia in search of the Promised One, whom they felt certain was already in their midst. One such man was Mullah Hussein. After 40 days of prayer and fasting, Mullah Hussein set out on his journey of search. He felt drawn as if by a magnet to the city of Shiraz. As he approached the city, Mullah Hussein saw a youth advancing toward him, who greeted him with a smile of loving welcome. Mullah Hussein himself has described that meeting. The youth extended to me a warm invitation to visit his home, and there refresh myself after the fatigues of my journey. As I followed him, his gait, the charm of his voice, the dignity of his bearing, served to enhance my first impressions of this unexpected meeting. We soon found ourselves standing at the gate of a house of modest appearance. As I entered the house and followed my host to his chamber, a feeling of unutterable joy invaded my being. It was in this house, at 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset on May 22nd, 1844, that the young man revealed to Mullah Hussein that he was the promised one. This moment marks the beginning of the Baha'i era. The young man called himself the Bab, which means the gate. His teachings would open a gateway to a new age for mankind. Like the disciples of Christ, the followers of the Bab spread throughout the towns and villages of their native land and beyond. Wherever they went, they told the people of the Bab's message, that he had come to call men back to God and to establish the equality of men and women. And most important, that he was but a humble forerunner of an even greater prophet yet to come. Baha'u'llah, the glory of God. As the message of the Bab spread throughout the land, the government and religious leaders became fearful and suspicious. The Shah sent soldiers to arrest the Bab. He was locked away in the citadel of Tabriz. But the people of Tabriz, some curious, some sincere, were eager to see him and learn of his teachings. So the Bab was sent to the mountains far in the north and cast into the prison of Maku. The leaders of Persia were certain his influence would die out. But the new faith continued to spread like wildfire. A steady flow of pilgrims journeyed north to visit the imprisoned Bab. The Persian officials, alarmed by the Bab's influence, then transferred him to the prison of Chirik, but the Bab continued to win the hearts of all who met him. At length he was brought back to Tabriz for questioning. "Whom do you claim to be?" his captors demanded. The Bab addressed the assemblage. I am the promised one. I am the one whose name you have for 1,000 years invoked, at whose mention you have risen, whose advent you have longed to witness, and the very hour of whose revelation you have prayed God to hasten. Every attempt to discredit the Bab served only to increase his popularity. It was decided that the only way to put an end to this new faith was to kill the Bab himself. On the day of execution, more than 10,000 people crowded the streets and rooftops to catch a glimpse of the man who claimed to be a messenger of God. At noon on July 9, 1850, in the barrack square of Tabriz, a firing squad of 750 soldiers was drawn up. The Bab was suspended from a post, and his body was riddled with bullets. The new monarch, Nasruddin Shah, personally had given the command to exterminate the followers of the Bab. Wherever they could be found, the Babis were arrested. Their houses and their possessions were taken from them. Many were turned over to the mob and met their deaths in the most cruel and horrible manner. Entire families had their throats cut. more than 20,000 martyrs gave up their lives for the new revelation. So many pure souls, it seemed, had died in vain. The short life of the Bab seemed to be one of the saddest and most fruitless. But there was the Bab's promise. An important part of his mission, he had said, was to prepare the way for one even greater than himself. He had warned his followers to watch and be ready, for Baha'u'llah, the glory of God, though one foretold by all the messengers of the past, would soon appear. When the Bab declared his mission, there was a young nobleman living in this house in Tehran. His name was Mirza Hussein Ali. Although he had been raised in great wealth, and his father had occupied an important position in the government, he accepted the Bab's message without hesitation. During the persecutions that followed the martyrdom of the Bab, this young man was taken in chains to the southern part of the city and thrown into a dungeon called the Siyachal, the Black Pit. He later described those events with his own pen. The dungeon was wrapped in thick darkness, and our fellow prisoners numbered nearly 150 souls, thieves, assassins, and highwaymen. No pen can depict that place, nor any tongue describe its loathsome smell. One night, in a dream, these exalted words were heard on every side. Verily we shall render thee victorious by thyself and by thy pen. Grieve thou not for that which hath befallen thee, for thou art in safety. This young follower of the Bab was Baha'u'llah, the promised glory of God. Baha'u'llah was released from the dungeon, but the Shah ordered him to leave Persia forever. Baha'u'llah and his family, along with a few friends, set out in the midst of winter for Baghdad in Iraq. Baha'u'llah did not immediately tell his friends that he was the one foretold by the Bab. Just as Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness, so Baha'u'llah, after reaching Baghdad, withdrew into the mountains to pray and to meditate. It was 10 years later, in April 1863, that Baha'u'llah gathered his family and friends in the Garden of Rizwan, outside the city of Baghdad, and told them what many of them had already begun to suspect. He was the glory of God, the one promised by the Bab. Because of Baha'u'llah's growing popularity, and because Baghdad was so close to Persia, the Shah persuaded the Sultan of Turkey to have him sent to a more distant place. Baha'u'llah was brought to Constantinople and then to Adrianople. Always close to Baha'u'llah and sharing the hardships of his exile were his two sons, Mirza Mahdi, the purest branch, and Abdu'l-Baha, the master. It was in Adrianople that great trouble befell the small community of Baha'is. Mirza Yahya, one of Baha'u'llah's half-brothers, openly tried to split the Baha'i faith by proclaiming himself to be its leader. He even poisoned Baha'u'llah. Mirza Yahya was sent to Cyprus by the Turkish government. His hopes of splitting the faith came to nothing, and in the end he was abandoned even by those whom he had led astray. But the mischief caused by the covenant breakers in Adrianople aroused the anger of the Turkish government. In 1868, Baha'u'llah was exiled a fourth time to the prison city of Akka in the Holy Land. By this banishment, the ancient Jewish prophecies were fulfilled. In the book of Micah it is written, "He shall come even to thee from Assyria, and from the fortified cities, and from sea to sea, and from mountain to mountain. After a miserable voyage, Baha'u'llah, his family, and his companions reached Haifa at the foot of Mount Carmel. Almost 3,000 years earlier, the prophet Amos had foretold his coming. The Lord will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the habitations of the shepherd shall mourn, and the top of Carmel shall wither. The prisoners were transferred to small boats and taken across the bay to Akka. In those days, the worst criminals of the Turkish Empire were sent to Akka. Baha'u'llah wrote, "It is the most desolate of the cities of the world, the most unsightly of them in appearance, the most detestable in climate, and the foulest in water. It is as though it were the metropolis of the owl." So foul was the air in Akka that, according to a legend, when a bird flew over the city, it would drop dead. A notice had been read in the principal mosque of the city, warning the people that Baha'u'llah and his companions were dangerous criminals, and that no kindness should be shown to them. As the tiny band of exiles waded ashore, sick and exhausted, the people of Akka came crowding around to jeer and to mock them. They were led through the sea gate, one of the two entrances to the city. Of this moment, Baha'u'llah wrote, "Upon our arrival we were welcomed with banners of light, whereupon the voice of the Spirit cried out, saying, 'Soon will all that dwell on earth be enlisted under these banners.' The prisoners were taken to the barracks, and the massive doors were closed behind them and bolted. Bahi'a Khanum, Baha'u'llah's daughter, later said that of all the terrible experiences she suffered in her life, the day of their arrival in Akka was the most awful. The mud in the prison was ankle deep, and the smell was so sickening that she collapsed and had to be carried to the prison cell. Baha'u'llah and his companions, numbering about 70 men, women, and children, were confined in close quarters and were given only bread and water to eat. Almost all of them fell deathly ill. Baha'u'llah has written of this time, "Know thou that upon our arrival at this spot, we chose to designate it as the most great prison. Though previously subjected in another land to chains and fetters, we yet refuse to call it by that name. Say, ponder thereon, O ye endued with understanding." The pain of separation from their Lord was too great for the followers of Baha'u'llah. Thus pilgrims journeyed, sometimes on foot, all the way from Persia to visit him. But the covenant breakers stood watch at the city gate and reported to the prison authorities any believers that tried to enter the city. The pilgrims could only stand outside the city wall and catch a glimpse of Baha'u'llah's face in the prison window. One such pilgrim, arriving from Masun, gazed for hours at the window, but because of the feebleness of his sight, he was unable to see Baha'u'llah's face. Along with these sorrows, a terrible tragedy occurred. Mirza Mehdi, the purest branch, Baha'u'llah's 22-year-old son, fell from the prison roof onto a crate which pierced his ribs. His dying wish was that his life might be accepted as a ransom for those who were prevented from attaining his father's presence. 4 months later, the severe restrictions were relaxed. and the prisoners were permitted to live in houses, though still confined within the city walls. It was in Akka, in the house of Abud, that Baha'u'llah wrote his most holy book, the Kitab-i Aqdas, the Book of Laws. In this very room, God inspired Baha'u'llah with the laws and principles that would guide the destiny of mankind for the next 1,000 years. Confined for almost 7 years to this house, day after day, pacing the floors of its rooms and corridors, the prisoner of Akka addressed the kings and rulers of the world. O kings of the earth, the most great law hath been revealed in this spot, this scene of transcendent splendor. Ye are but vassals, O kings of the earth. He who is the King of kings hath appeared, arrayed in his most wondrous glory, and is summoning you unto himself, the help in peril, the self-subsisting. One day, while dictating a tablet, Baha'u'llah heard shouts in the street below. He looked out of the window to see the house surrounded by soldiers. 7 of his followers had conspired secretly and killed 3 of the covenant breakers. Baha'u'llah was taken to the governorate and interrogated. 25 of his companions were put in chains and thrown back into prison. Baha'u'llah wrote, "My captivity cannot harm me. That which can harm me is the conduct of those who love me, who claim to be related to me, and yet perpetrate what causeth my heart and my pen to groan." After this incident, the people of Akka, already fearful and suspicious of the Baha'is, became fired with uncontrollable hatred. Whenever the Baha'i children ventured into the streets, they were harassed and pelted with stones. It was due, among other things, to the patience and kindness of Baha'u'llah's eldest son, Abdu'l-Baha, that the hostility of the people was gradually changed into friendliness and respect for the Baha'is. In time, it became easier for pilgrims to visit Akka. Often they would stay at this inn where Abdu'l-Baha would prepare them to meet his father. For 9 years, Baha'u'llah had not set foot outside the oppressive city walls, yet he loved the beauty of the country. Eventually, the prison authorities, who had come to respect and love Baha'u'llah, permitted him to live outside the city. Abdu'l-Baha rented a house for him at Mazrai, about 4 miles north of Akka. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by lovely gardens and containing a stream of running water. Baha'u'llah lived at Mazrai for about 2 years. One of Baha'u'llah's favorite spots at this time was a garden not far from the gates of Akka. It was situated on an island in the middle of a stream, and he came here often to pray and to meditate. Later, Baha'u'llah and his family moved to a lofty mansion nearby called Baji, which means delight. It was at Baji in 1890 that the well-known scholar E.G. Brown of Cambridge University met Baha'u'llah. His own pen has recorded his impressions. I found myself in a large apartment, along the upper end of which ran a low divan. A second or two elapsed ere, with a throb of wonder and awe, I became definitely conscious that the room was not untenanted. In the corner where the divan met the wall sat a wondrous and venerable figure, crowned with a felt headdress of the kind called Taj, but of unusual height and make. The face of him on whom I gazed I can never forget, though I cannot describe it. Those piercing eyes seemed to read one's very soul. Power and authority sat on that ample brow. No need to ask in whose presence I stood, as I bowed myself before one who was the object of a devotion and love which kings might envy and emperors sigh for in vain. That same year, Baha'u'llah visited Mount Carmel, across the bay from Akka, extolled by Isaiah as the mountain of the Lord, to which all nations shall flow. Baha'u'llah visited Mount Carmel 4 times. At one time, he stood midway up the mountainside and pointed out to Abdu'l-Baha the spot where the Bab's remains should be laid to rest. In those days, Haifa was a small village at the foot of Mount Carmel. It was settled mainly by Templars, a deeply religious people who had come from Germany to wait for Jesus. The second coming, they believed, was at hand. Many of them carved verses from the Bible over their doors. In 1871, when Baha'u'llah was across the bay in Akka, one devout Templar carved this inscription over the door of his house: Der Herr ist nah. The Lord is nigh. At another time, Baha'u'llah pitched his tent near the cave of Elijah, on a spot marked by this obelisk, and revealed the tablet of Carmel. Haste thee, O Carmel, for lo, the light of the countenance of God hath been lifted upon thee. Rejoice, for God hath in this day established upon thee his throne. In 1892, Baha'u'llah's earthly life came to a close. The news of his ascension was sent to the Sultan of Turkey in a telegram which began, "The sun of Baha has set." Baha'u'llah was laid to rest in a small house adjacent to the mansion of Baji. He had spent almost 40 years in exile and imprisonment. Today, his shrine is surrounded by beautiful gardens. The mansion of Baji has, through the loving care of the Baha'is, become a spot renowned for its peace and beauty. Each year, Baha'i pilgrims come from all parts of the world to visit Baji and to offer prayers at the shrine of Baha'u'llah. They are welcomed in the spirit of love and brotherhood that has brought together the hearts of Baha'is the world over. From the city of Akka, the spirit of Baha'u'llah was released throughout the world. Abdu'l-Baha wrote, "From this prison, his light was shed abroad, and the proclamation of his glory reached the east and the west." And Baha'u'llah wrote, "The Almighty hath transformed this prison house into the most exalted paradise, the heaven of heavens." Today, halfway up the slopes of Mount Carmel, on the spot designated by Baha'u'llah, stands the shrine of the Bab, the martyred herald of the Baha'i revelation. This is the world's center of a faith whose destiny it is to usher in the long-awaited kingdom of God on earth. Each year a swelling stream of pilgrims arrives from every corner of the world, foreshadowing the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Baha'u'llah has written, The time foreordained unto the peoples and kindreds of the earth is now come. The promises of God, as recorded in the Holy Scriptures, have all been fulfilled. Happy is the man that pondereth in his heart that which hath been revealed in the books of God, the help in peril, the self-subsisting.